two women, a tin box on wheels, zero filming experience, and a plan so unconventional that most people in their lives couldn't quite believe they were serious. That's where the story of Crystal Drinkwalter and Jazmyn Canning begins. Not with money, not with connections, not with a roadmap. Just two servers from Barrie, Ontario, who looked at the life they were living and quietly decided it wasn't enough. What followed was one of the most quietly remarkable underdog stories on the internet. No drama, no breakdowns, no falling apart. Just two people who refused to stop moving forward, and who built something real while the doubters were still waiting for them to fail. This is the story of how Vanwives went from a cramped Honda Civic to a van to a cabin in the woods of Nova Scotia, and a cabin to a concrete house being built by hand in Mexico. And through every single chapter, there were people who said it couldn't be done. They were wrong every time. The two of them met in 2016, and it wasn't exactly a dramatic first encounter. Jazmyn Canning and Crystal Drinkwalter were both working as servers at the same restaurant in Barrie, Ontario. After a shift one evening, they went out for drinks. They had a great time. They were, as Jazmyn later described it, inseparable from that point on. Crystal was living with a friend. Jazmyn was living with her mom. Neither of them came from wealthy families. Neither of them had savings stashed away. What they did have was a shared pull towards something bigger. A restlessness that didn't have a name yet. In the early days of the relationship, Jazmyn's Australian shepherds, Bella and Izzy, became a fixture of their weekends. Road trips in her Honda Civic. Long drives that went nowhere in particular, just to be moving. The car was cramped with two people and two dogs, but they loved it anyway. And somewhere inside those long drives, an idea started forming. Jazmyn did some research. She discovered van life, a community of people who converted vehicles into mobile homes and simply drove. It wasn't a mainstream concept at the time. It certainly wasn't something either of them had grown up around. But the more they looked into it, the more it made sense. They could travel. They could live on the road. They could do it on a budget if they were smart about it. In May 2018, they flew to Calgary, picked up a 2006 Mercedes Sprinter on Kijiji for $14,000, and drove it back to Barrie. The van was, in Jazmyn's own words, basically a tin box. No plumbing, no power, no insulation worth mentioning, just a metal shell with wheels. They spent the next 8 months converting it themselves. They learned electrical, they learned plumbing. They installed a pressurized water system from scratch, a built-in thermostat, solar-powered electrics, a kitchen with a cooktop and a fridge, benches that folded into a bed, and wood paneling to make it feel like home. By the time they were done, they had put another $10,000 into the build, $24,000 total out of their own pockets. Every cent saved from waiting tables. Most people they knew thought it was a phase, a wild idea that would fizzle out before it started. Two young women with no technical background had just hand-built a functioning home inside a delivery van, and the prevailing assumption was that they'd be back in a regular apartment within months. That assumption aged very badly. In February 2019, Crystal and Jazmyn set off. The plan was ambitious. Drive from Canada, through the United States, all the way down to the southern tip of Argentina. It was the kind of trip most people dream about and then file away under one day. They were actually doing it. They weren't filming yet. That came later, and it came from a stranger. Somewhere in the United States, someone saw what they were doing and told them they needed to be capturing it. These were two women doing something that almost nobody around them had done, crossing borders solo, navigating foreign countries with two dogs in tow, figuring out breakdowns by the side of the road, and somehow making it work. The person's message was simple. People need to see this. They bought their first camera in Las Vegas, and that decision changed the entire trajectory of what Vanwives would become. The early footage was raw. The storytelling got sharper as they went. They were learning filmmaking in real time, on the road, with no crew and no budget, just the two of them and a camera they'd picked up in Nevada. What they lacked in production polish they made up for in authenticity, and viewers responded to that from the very beginning. They pushed through Mexico, through Central America. They reached Guatemala. Then, in March 2020, the world stopped. COVID-19 hit while they were in Guatemala, and the options were not good. Flying home meant figuring out where to store the van and what to do with Bella and Izzy. Only service dogs were allowed on the flights that were actually taking off, which wasn't many. People were buying tickets and watching planes get grounded. The situation was deteriorating fast. They didn't even consider driving at first. Guatemala to Canada felt impossible. But as the options kept narrowing, the math became clear. They couldn't fly. They couldn't wait. So they drove. In just over a week, they covered more than 5,000 kilometers across 4 countries and made it back to Canada. It was the kind of logistical push that most people wouldn't even attempt under normal circumstances. And they did it in the middle of a global crisis, in a converted van, with 2 Australian shepherds. They documented all of it. That moment said something about who these 2 actually were. When circumstances pushed in, they pushed back harder. There was no collapsing. There was no giving up on the trip, or the channel, or each other. They adapted, they moved, and they filmed. By the time they were back home and processing everything that had happened, the channel had started to find its audience. And that audience was responding to something specific, not just the travel footage, but the identity behind it. Crystal and Jazmyn were openly an LGBTQ couple, in a space where that visibility was relatively rare. Their license plate read Vanwives. Their Instagram was unapologetically them, and while the van life community was mostly welcoming, the outside world sometimes wasn't. At one American border crossing, a guard looked at them and said, without any apparent embarrassment, "It's a shame you 2 are gay." They took their passports, kept their faces neutral, and drove away. After that incident, they talked about changing the license plate. It would have been the easier path, less conspicuous, fewer pointed comments, less to deal with, but they kept it, because it had brought them joy, and they weren't willing to let someone else's hostility take that away from them. That decision, small as it sounds, was characteristic of how they handled almost everything. They didn't perform toughness, they didn't make speeches, they just kept going, and they kept being exactly who they were while they did it. The fan mail reflected what that meant to people. One woman left a handwritten note on their van, a physical note on the vehicle itself, that said thank you for being present in the LGBT community of traveling. Jazmyn spoke about other women who told her they'd always wanted to travel internationally, but were too scared, and that watching 2 women do it made them feel like they could too. That kind of impact doesn't come from playing it safe. After eventually completing their journey south and back, Crystal and Jazmyn returned to Canada with a decision to make. The road trip was over. The van chapter, in its original form, was done. Most people assumed the channel would wind down, or they'd pivot to something else entirely, or the whole thing would quietly fade out. Instead, they leveled up. In 2022, they purchased a 15-acre property in Nova Scotia, remote land in the Maritimes, in Canada's East Coast wilderness. The property came with a cabin that needed serious work. Neither of them had construction experience. Neither of them had renovated anything close to this scale. They'd built a van interior with YouTube tutorials and stubbornness, and now they were taking on a full off-grid property in the Canadian woods. They described the feeling themselves. The Maritimes felt like home in a way nowhere else had, and they'd crossed Canada 3 times. The people were warm, the pace was slower, and the land was the kind of remote they'd always been drawn to. Still only about an hour and a half from stores, but surrounded by the kind of quiet that's genuinely hard to find. What happened next was one of the most watched chapters of the Vanwives story. Viewers who had followed the van life content stuck around and brought friends. The cabin content opened a completely new audience. People who had never been interested in van life were suddenly watching 2 women pour concrete, frame walls, do electrical work, build a second story, and install a geodesic dome greenhouse capable of growing food through a Canadian winter. They signed with Knight, the same management company behind Mr. Beast, in early 2023. That deal spoke volumes about what the industry thought of their trajectory. Knight doesn't sign creators who are winding down. Crystal summed up the pivot perfectly at the time. We're doing DIY renovations that are quite complex and exciting to shoot and see come together. It's out of our comfort zone for sure, but that's part of the inspiration behind all this. We're trying to inspire others to try something new sometimes. That sentence, out of our comfort zone, but that's part of the inspiration, could have been their motto from day one. The off-grid cabin project ran for several years and became the core identity of the channel during that period. Viewers watched them build a second story onto the cabin. They watched the geodesic dome greenhouse go up. They watched Bella and Izzy get older and slower and still make appearances in the woods. They watched 2 people who started with 0 construction knowledge become genuinely skilled, capable builders, not because they had money or professional help, but because they were relentless about learning. The podcast launched during this period too. The Pack Chat, recorded from inside the cabin in the woods, gave Jazmyn and Crystal a platform to talk beyond the camera, about life behind the content, intentional living, relationships, how to take big risks, how to find your community. It ran weekly and pulled in a loyal listener base on top of the YouTube audience. At their peak Nova Scotia chapter, the Vanwives had grown to over 500,000 YouTube subscribers. Their Facebook page had more than 500,000 followers. Instagram sat at 235,000. The combined view count was into the tens of millions and climbing. Brand deals rolled in: Simply Safe, PetSmart, Incogni, Seed, Amazon affiliate income, Patreon subscribers who wanted a closer connection to the journey. The operation that two waitresses had funded by saving tips had become a legitimate media brand. And still, at every stage, there were people in comment sections asking how long it could last, saying the audience would get bored, saying they'd run out of things to build, saying the lifestyle wasn't sustainable. Then, in early 2026, Vanwives announced their next project. And it wasn't what anyone predicted. They were building a concrete tiny house in Mexico. From the ground up, their own hands, no prior experience with concrete construction. Episode after episode showed the foundations being poured, the first blocks being laid, the walls going up, the roof taking shape. By April 2026, the build was complete. That arc, from a tin box van in a Barrie parking lot to a hand-poured concrete home in Mexico, is almost implausible when you map it out. And yet every step was documented, every mistake, every setback, every moment of figuring it out on the fly. The channel tagline had always been, "Trying things we once thought we couldn't do." The Mexico build was proof that the list of things they thought they couldn't do kept expanding, and they kept crossing things off it. The subscriber count at the time of the Mexico build completion sat north of 700,000. Nearly a decade after the Sprinter van was purchased in Calgary and driven back to Barrie as a shell, Crystal and Jazmyn were still on camera, still building, still growing. It's worth being direct about the scale of what was built here. Two people with no formal education in content creation, no media connections, no startup capital, and no existing audience took a YouTube channel from zero and grew it into something that generates real income across multiple streams simultaneously. Ad revenue on a channel with hundreds of millions of cumulative views and consistent monthly traffic is significant. Layer in brand sponsorships from recognizable companies, Amazon affiliate commissions on recommended gear, Patreon supporters, a merchandise line, a podcast, and representation from a top-tier talent management company, and the picture becomes clear. The critics who questioned whether two waitresses with a van could sustain a career got their answer a long time ago. The answer was yes, and then some. But the more interesting thing isn't the money, it's the consistency. Most YouTube channels that start with a single premise, van life in this case, peak early and die out when the original premise exhausts itself. Vanwives never allowed themselves to be pinned down by a single era. They moved from van life to an international road trip, to a pandemic drive home, to a wilderness cabin build, to a Mexican concrete house. Each chapter was genuinely new. Each chapter came with a learning curve they tackled head-on. That adaptability is rarer than it looks. Most people, when their comfortable routine ends, reach for the nearest version of what they already know. Crystal and Jazmyn consistently reached for something harder. There's a quote from Jazmyn that has stuck around in coverage of the channel since the early days. She was describing the reaction of women who saw what they were doing and felt something shift. Women who had been afraid to travel, afraid to be visible, afraid to try. She said they would tell her, "We're two females doing it, so they think they can now." That sentence is the whole story, really. The criticism, the homophobia at the border, the doubt from people who thought the van would break down within weeks, the assumption that two women without construction backgrounds couldn't build anything worth watching. All of it was answered with footage. Not arguments, not clapbacks, footage. Every video was a response to every person who said it wouldn't work. And that footage is still sitting on YouTube, accumulating views, inspiring people the pair will never meet, proving that the thing they didn't know how to do yet was never a reason to stop. They started their channel with a motto stitched into everything they made: trying things we once thought we couldn't do. They've been making good on that promise for going on a decade now. And if their track record is anything to go by, the list of things they can't do is getting shorter by the year.